The champagne was supposed to celebrate his freedom. Instead, it shattered on marble floors, just like everything Damian Cross thought he owned. He walked into that Manhattan courtroom expecting his meek, discarded wife to sign papers and disappear. What he found was a woman flanked by New York's most dangerous man, armed with documents that would unravel his entire existence. By the time the judge's gavel fell, Damian would learn a truth that would destroy him. The empire he built his arrogance on had never been his at all. Stay until the end to see how one woman's silence became the loudest revenge. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. The Louis Vuitton heels clicked against the courthouse steps, with the kind of confidence that came from being 23 and beautiful and certain the world owed you something. Jessica Crane didn't just walk, she performed, each movement calculated to draw eyes, to remind everyone in a 6-block radius that she was the upgrade, the prize, the reason Damian Cross had finally gotten smart enough to trade in his boring wife for something better. Baby, you're overthinking this. Her voice carried that particular pitch of manufactured sweetness, the kind that probably worked wonders on college boys but grated against the gray March sky like nails on slate. She's got nothing. Everyone knows it. This is just a formality. Damian adjusted his Tom Ford tie, midnight blue, $600, the kind of detail that separated men from boys, and allowed himself a smile. The courthouse loomed above them, all stone columns and the weight of institutional authority, but he felt none of its gravity. Why should he? The law was a tool, and he'd spent 15 years learning exactly how to use it to his advantage. Formality, he repeated, tasting the word. Yeah, that's exactly what this is. The champagne bottle sweated condensation against his palm. Dom Perignon, 2012, chilling in his driver's ice bucket since 7 this morning. He'd planned this moment down to the minute. Walk out of the courtroom, papers signed, pop the cork right there on the courthouse steps while cameras rolled. Let Clara see what winning looked like. Let her understand, finally, that she'd been a placeholder all along. A starter wife who'd served her purpose and could now be discarded with the minimum legally required consideration. His phone buzzed. Marcus Chen, his lawyer. Harvard Law. Shark in an Armani suit. Billing rate that would make most people nauseous. Courtroom 4B, 3rd floor. We're up in 20 minutes. Damian pocketed the phone and gestured toward the entrance. Come on, let's get this over with. They passed through security, the usual theater of metal detectors and bored guards who'd seen every variety of human drama parade through these halls. Jessica kept her hand locked in his, nails digging into his palm with what he supposed was meant to be reassurance but felt more like possession. 6 months together, and she still hadn't learned the difference between confidence and desperation. The elevator dinged on the 3rd floor, opening onto a hallway that smelled like floor polish and recycled air, and the particular staleness of places where people's lives got dismantled on a regular schedule. Other couples waited on benches, some holding hands, others maintaining careful distance, all wearing the same expression of people waiting for surgery they couldn't afford but couldn't avoid. There. Jessica pointed toward a door marked 4B with the kind of unnecessary enthusiasm that made him wonder briefly if she'd rehearsed this part too. Ready to be free? Free. The word landed different than she probably intended. Free of what, exactly? Clara had never held him back. If anything, she'd been too accommodating, too willing to fade into the background while he built his empire from nothing. From the tiny tech startup they'd launched in their Brooklyn apartment, surviving on ramen and Audacity, to cross-digital solutions, a company that now employed 400 people across 3 continents and pulled in revenue that would have seemed like fantasy 15 years ago. She'd been there for all of it. The lean years, the 80-hour weeks, the 3 failed product launches before they finally cracked the code on enterprise data security. Clara, with her spreadsheets and her quiet competence, managing operations while he handled clients, making sure the light stayed on while he chased the next big contract. But that was the thing about being present. It didn't mean you were essential. It didn't mean you'd built anything. It meant you'd watched while someone else did the actual building. Damian pushed open the courtroom door. The room was smaller than he'd expected, more administrative than dramatic. Fluorescent lights, wooden benches worn smooth by decades of nervous hands, a judge's bench that looked like it had been salvaged from a 1970s government surplus sale. Windows overlooked a gray slice of Manhattan, buildings stacked against each other like filing cabinets full of other people's problems. Marcus was already there, seated at the plaintiff's table, organizing documents with the methodical precision of a man billing by the quarter hour. He looked up, nodded once, all business, no warmth, exactly what Damien was paying for. "Right on time," Marcus said, voice pitched low. "She's not here yet." "Of course she's not." Jessica settled into the seat beside Damien, crossing her legs with deliberate elegance. Probably still trying to find something appropriate to wear. Does she even own anything that isn't from, like, Ann Taylor Loft? Damien didn't answer. His attention had snagged on something else, something that prickled at the base of his skull like a warning his conscious mind hadn't caught up to yet. The courtroom felt different than he'd anticipated. Not empty exactly, but populated with the wrong kind of energy. A court officer stood by the door, face neutral but eyes tracking. The stenographer was already in position, fingers poised over keys. And near the back, in the gallery. "Who's that?" Jessica's question cut through his thoughts. 3 men sat in the back row. Not lawyers, wrong clothes, wrong posture. They wore dark suits that fit too well, faces that revealed nothing, the kind of stillness that came from training or instinct or both. Security, maybe, private contractors. The type of people who got paid to be invisible until the moment they needed to become very, very visible. "No idea," Damien said, but the prickling intensified. The door opened again. Naomi Reed entered first. Damien recognized her from the preliminary filings, Clara's attorney, a woman whose reputation preceded her like a weather system. Mid-40s, black, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Jessica's entire outfit, carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had survived several wars and won them all. She moved with the kind of economy that suggested every action had been calculated for maximum efficiency. No wasted motion, no performative confidence, because the real thing didn't need advertising. Behind her, Clara. Damien felt his smile falter, just for a second, just long enough to register something was wrong with the picture he'd painted in his head. She didn't look broken. That was the first problem. The Clara he'd expected, the Clara he'd constructed in his imagination over the past 6 months, was supposed to shuffle in wearing grief like an old sweater, shoulders hunched, eyes down, the physical manifestation of defeat. A woman who'd just lost everything and knew it. The woman who walked through that door wore a navy dress, simple, elegant, expensive in a way that didn't scream but whispered, and heels that put her at 5'9". Her dark hair was pulled back in a way that emphasized bone structure he'd somehow stopped noticing years ago. No tears, no trembling hands, just a kind of composed stillness that made his earlier confidence feel suddenly thin, like ice over water that might not hold his weight. And beside her, "Jesus Christ," Marcus muttered, so quiet Jessica probably didn't hear it. The man who entered behind Clara and Naomi was tall enough that he had to mind the doorframe. 6'3", maybe 6'4", built like someone who'd learned physical presence as a second language and spoken it fluently enough to forget his first. Dark hair touched with gray at the temples, a face that belonged in a Renaissance painting of a tyrant or a saint, depending on the lighting. His suit was bespoke. Damien knew enough about tailoring to recognize when fabric had been cut specifically for a body, when every seam existed in exactly the right place. But it wasn't the suit that made 3 people in the gallery sit up straighter. It wasn't even the physical presence, though that was considerable. It was something else, something that lived in the way he moved, the way space seemed to rearrange itself around him, the way the court officer's hand drifted, just slightly, just unconsciously, closer to his radio. Power. Not the kind you bought or inherited, the kind you took and kept and made other people remember. Adrian Volkov. Damien didn't know how he knew the name, some half-remembered article maybe, or gossip from the kind of circles where money and influence intersected with things polite society pretended didn't exist. Russian-American businessman, the articles always said, which was journalism's way of saying, we know exactly what he is, but can't prove it in court. Import-export, the euphemism went. Consulting. Private security. All the phrases that meant please don't look too closely at how the sausage gets made. Volkov settled into the chair beside Clara with the kind of attention to detail that suggested he'd already mapped every exit, identified every potential threat, and calculated 17 different ways to respond if things went sideways. His hand rested on the table between them, not touching Clara, not claiming her, just there, present. A statement without words. Clara glanced at him once, and he inclined his head maybe an inch. No one else would have even registered it as communication. But Damien saw it, an entire conversation in the space of a shared glance. What the hell is this? Jessica's whisper had edges. Who is that guy? Not our concern. Marcus had already recovered his professional detachment, but Damien caught the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his pen clicked twice against his legal pad. A nervous tell he'd probably spent years trying to eliminate. Whatever theater she's arranged, it doesn't change the fundamentals. We have the stronger position. Did they? Damien found himself reassessing. The champagne bottle suddenly felt less like a victory prop and more like evidence of miscalculation, the kind of showy confidence that aged poorly in retrospect. He'd expected a formality. Sign the papers, split the assets according to the prenuptial agreement they'd signed 15 years ago when neither of them had anything worth fighting over. Walk away clean. Clara would get the brownstone in Brooklyn, maybe a token percentage of the business as acknowledgement of her early contributions, enough to keep her comfortable while he moved on to the life he actually wanted. Simple. Clean. Done. But nothing about the scene in front of him looked simple. The judge entered, a woman in her 60s with gray hair, and the kind of face that suggested she'd stopped being impressed by anything around 1987. Judge Ellen Hartfield, according to the nameplate. She settled behind her bench with the weary efficiency of someone running through their 1000th iteration of the same basic script. All rise, the court officer intoned, unnecessarily since everyone was already standing. Be seated. Judge Hartfield shuffled papers without looking up. Case number 2024-D-17893, Cross versus Cross. Petition for divorce and division of marital assets. She glanced up then, gaze sweeping the room with clinical disinterest. Counsel for the petitioner? Marcus stood. Marcus Chen for Mr. Damien Cross, Your Honor. And for the respondent? Naomi rose, and somehow the simple act of standing seemed to shift the room's gravity. Naomi Reed for Mrs. Clara Hayes Cross, Your Honor. Hayes Cross. She'd kept the hyphenate. Damien felt an irrational flash of irritation. Why keep his name if she was so eager to be done with him? But then he caught the slight curve of Naomi's mouth, the deliberate emphasis on the full name, and understood, not attachment, strategy. Very well. The judge made a note. Mr. Chen, I've reviewed your preliminary filings. This appears relatively straightforward. 15-year marriage, no children, existing prenuptial agreement dated March 2009. You're seeking an uncontested dissolution with asset division per the prenup's terms? That's correct, Your Honor. Marcus projected exactly the right blend of respect and confidence. We believe Mrs. Cross understands the agreement's provisions and will consent to standard distribution. My client has prepared a settlement offer that exceeds the prenuptial minimums as a gesture of, Your Honor, if I may. Naomi's interruption was perfectly timed, perfectly pitched, not aggressive, just present. There are some preliminary matters we need to address before we discuss settlement terms. Judge Hartfield's eyebrow rose a fraction. Such as? The validity of the prenuptial agreement, for starters. And more significantly, the actual ownership structure of the assets Mr. Cross claims as marital property, subject to division. The courtroom went very still. Marcus recovered fast. Damien had to give him credit for that. Your Honor, the prenup has been in force for 15 years. Any challenge to its validity should have been raised long before. We're not challenging its validity in terms of execution, Naomi said smoothly. We're noting that it's irrelevant to the current proceedings because it addresses division of assets that don't in fact belong to Mr. Cross. Damien felt Jessica's hand tighten on his arm. He shook her off, leaning forward. What the hell is she talking about? Marcus held up a hand. Wait, trust me. Let me handle this. Judge Hartfield looked intrigued for the first time since entering the room. Ms. Reed, that's a significant claim. I assume you have documentation? Extensive documentation, Your Honor. Naomi reached into her briefcase without hurry, extracting a bound folder thick enough to stop a bullet. If the court will indulge me, I'd like to walk through the actual history of cross-digital solutions. Not the story that's been told, but the facts as recorded in corporate filings, financial records, and testimony from individuals who were present at the company's founding. This is absurd. Marcus's voice had a new edge now, the sound of a man whose script had been crumpled up and tossed aside. Your Honor, this is a divorce proceeding, not a corporate audit. The ownership of Cross Digital is a matter of public record. My client is the sole proprietor and CEO, as he has been since the company's founding in 2009. Actually, Naomi said, he hasn't been. But I understand the confusion. A lot of people have believed that story. Mr. Cross has certainly told it often enough. The implication landed like a slap. Damien felt heat crawl up his neck. I built that company from nothing. Mr. Cross, Judge Hartfield's voice could have frozen water. You'll have time to speak. Right now I'm listening to Ms. Reed. Continue, Counselor. Naomi opened the folder. Your Honor, Clara Hayes entered into a romantic relationship with Damien Cross in January 2007, when both were working at different tech firms in Brooklyn. At that time, Ms. Hayes was a senior operations analyst with a background in both computer science and business administration. Mr. Cross was a mid-level sales representative. Irrelevant career details, Marcus objected. Foundation, Your Honor. It establishes competency and expertise, which becomes relevant shortly. Judge Hartfield nodded. I'll allow it. Get to the point, though. In March 2008, Ms. Hayes and Mr. Cross began developing a software solution for enterprise data security. The initial concept originated from Ms. Hayes' master's thesis at NYU. I have copies of that thesis here, dated and notarized, predating any involvement by Mr. Cross. Damien's stomach dropped. The thesis. He'd forgotten about the thesis. Naomi continued, voice steady as a metronome. Ms. Hayes provided not only the core intellectual property, but also the initial capital. In June 2008, she liquidated her retirement account, $47,000, to fund the prototype development. Mr. Cross contributed $8,000 from savings. The company was incorporated in September 2008 as Hayes Cross Technologies, with Clara Hayes listed as 60% owner and CEO. Damien Cross is 40% owner and VP of Sales. She slid a document across to the judge. Corporate filing from New York State, September 12, 2008, public record. The silence in the courtroom felt like something physical pressing against Damien's chest. Jessica had gone pale. Her earlier confidence evaporated. Marcus was flipping through papers with increasing urgency, looking for something to push back with. Now, Naomi said, in March 2009, Mr. Cross proposed marriage. Ms. Hayes accepted. They signed a prenuptial agreement drafted by Mr. Cross's attorney, not the same attorney, Your Honor, who's representing him today, which addressed personal assets and inheritance but made no mention of the business, as both parties understood they were equal partners in that venture. The business was marital property, Marcus argued, created during the relationship, developed jointly. It was Ms. Hayes' intellectual property, Naomi corrected, funded primarily by Ms. Hayes' capital, with Mr. Cross as a minority partner and employee. There's a distinction. Judge Hartfield was reading the corporate filing with the expression of someone who'd just found an unexpected plot twist in a book she'd thought was predictable. Ms. Reed, these documents show Ms. Hayes as the majority owner in 2008. What's the current ownership structure? That, Naomi said, is where it gets interesting. She pulled out another document, then another, then a whole stack, laying them out like a card dealer revealing a winning hand. In 2011, Cross Digital, by then rebranded from Hayes Cross Technologies at Mr. Cross's insistence, another red flag in retrospect, faced a significant legal challenge. A former employee claimed theft of proprietary code. The lawsuit was baseless, but it threatened the company's ability to secure financing. Banks wouldn't touch them. Investors backed away. Damien remembered that year, the stress, the sleepless nights, the dawning realization that one vindictive ex-employee could destroy everything they'd built. Mr. Cross's solution, Naomi continued, was to temporarily transfer his ownership stake to Ms. Hayes, making her the sole proprietor on paper. The reasoning was that if the company was owned entirely by someone who'd never been involved in the disputed code development, it would shield them from liability. She looked directly at Damien for the first time, and her expression wasn't triumphant or angry. It was something worse, pitying. Ms. Hayes agreed because she trusted her husband. The transfer was executed in April 2011. 100% ownership of Cross Digital Solutions transferred to Clara Hayes with a verbal understanding that it would be transferred back once the legal threat resolved. Marcus had found something. Your Honor, Marcus had found verbal agreements regarding asset transfers of this magnitude. I'm aware of the limitations of verbal contracts, Mr. Chen. The judge's attention hadn't left Naomi. Was it transferred back? No, Your Honor, because the legal threat didn't resolve for 3 years. By the time the lawsuit was dismissed in 2014, Cross Digital had grown substantially. Revenue had quadrupled. The company now had institutional investors, board members, complex stakeholder agreements. And somewhere in those years, Mr. Cross seems to have forgotten that he'd transferred ownership to his wife. I didn't forget, Damien said, the words escaping before Marcus could stop him. We both understood it was temporary. Did you? Naomi's question was surgical. Then why didn't you ever ask for it back? Why didn't you execute a reverse transfer? Why didn't you at any point in the subsequent 10 years formalize the arrangement you claim was always understood? Damien opened his mouth, closed it. Because the answer, the real answer, was that he'd been busy. Building the business, chasing contracts, making deals. The paperwork had seemed like a formality, something to handle later eventually when there was time. Clara had never pushed for it. She'd been content to let him run the company, to sign whatever documents his lawyers put in front of her, to fade into the background while he became the face of Cross Digital. It had never occurred to him that her silence might be strategic. Furthermore, Naomi said, during those 10 years, Ms. Hayes continued to fulfill her role as the company's actual owner. She signed off on major expenditures. She approved investor agreements. She remained on the corporate documents as sole proprietor, even as Mr. Cross represented himself publicly as the owner and CEO. And she did this while also managing the operational side of the business, the parts that didn't come with magazine profiles and conference speaking engagements. Another document hit the judge's bench. Financial records showing Ms. Hayes' signature on every major contract for the past decade. Board meeting minutes listing her as chairman, a title Mr. Cross never held, though he certainly implied otherwise in interviews. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere in the building, a door slammed. Damien felt like he was watching this happen to someone else, some other version of himself who'd made different choices, stupider choices, who'd somehow handed away an empire and then forgotten he'd done it. Your Honor, Marcus tried. Even if the ownership structure is as Ms. Reed describes, which we dispute, the fact remains that Mr. Cross built that company. His vision, his client relationships, his leadership, his sales work, Naomi agreed, which was valuable, which was compensated with a very generous salary that Ms. Hayes, as owner, approved year after year. A salary currently sitting at $950,000 annually, plus bonuses and stock options. She let that number hang in the air. Mr. Cross was an excellent employee, Naomi said, but an employee nonetheless. Jessica made a small sound, quickly stifled. Damien didn't look at her, couldn't look at her. His entire field of vision had narrowed to the woman sitting across from him, the woman he'd lived with for 15 years and apparently never actually seen. Clara met his gaze then, still calm, still composed, not gloating, which somehow made it worse, just watching him understand, piece by piece, exactly how thoroughly he'd miscalculated. And beside her, Adrian Volkov sat like a monument to consequences, saying nothing because nothing needed to be said. Judge Hartfield set down the documents. Ms. Reed, am I understanding correctly that you're claiming Cross Digital Solutions is not marital property subject to division, but rather Ms. Hayes' separate property owned prior to and throughout the marriage? That's exactly what I'm claiming, Your Honor, and I have a decade of documentation to prove it. This is insane, Damien found his voice, though it came out rougher than intended. Clara, what are you doing? We built this together. You can't just… Mr. Cross, the judge warned. But Clara spoke anyway, her voice cutting through the chaos for the first time since entering the courtroom. "You're right, Damien. We did build it together." Each word was carefully placed, deliberately chosen. I just kept better records of who contributed what. The courtroom had that stretched quality time gets when you're watching your life disassemble in real time. Damien heard the words, "better records contributed what?" But they landed wrong, like puzzle pieces from a different box forced into spaces where they didn't belong. "Your Honor, this is clearly a coordinated attempt to—" Marcus was on his feet, but his usual courtroom dominance had developed a tremor. "We need time to review these documents, to verify their authenticity. They're authentic." Naomi didn't even look at him. "They've been notarized, cross-referenced with state filings, and corroborated by third-party witnesses. I can provide the chain of custody for every single page if you'd like, but I suspect that would take more time than the court wants to allocate to Mr. Cross's denial." Judge Hartfield removed her glasses, cleaned them with the edge of her robe in a gesture that suggested this was about to get worse. "Mr. Chen, has your client reviewed the corporate documentation for his own company recently? Because if Ms. Reed is correct, this should not be news to him." That was the thing that made Damien's jaw clench hard enough to ache. It wasn't news. Not exactly. He'd signed the transfer papers in 2011, remembered the conversation with Clara at their kitchen table. "It's just temporary, just until this blows over." Her hand steady on the pen while his had shaken with rage at the employee who dared threaten everything they'd built. He'd trusted her. Why wouldn't he? She was his wife, his partner, the woman who'd stood beside him through every brutal 80-hour week. What he couldn't remember was ever asking for it back. "The documents may exist," Marcus said, recovering some of his footing. "But the context matters. This was clearly a temporary arrangement made under duress." "Under duress from a lawsuit that Mr. Cross created?" Naomi interjected. "Let's be clear about the source of that legal threat. The former employee who sued had legitimate grievances about hostile work environment, complaints that Mr. Cross dismissed, which led to the code theft allegations as retaliation. Ms. Hayes resolved that situation by settling generously against Mr. Cross's wishes and implementing HR policies he called excessive. She protected the company. He nearly destroyed it. "That's not—" Damien started, but Clara's voice cut through again. "The employee's name was Marcus Hall." She wasn't looking at Damien anymore, directing her words to the judge instead. 26 years old, brilliant programmer, diagnosed with Crohn's disease. He needed schedule flexibility for medical appointments. Damien told him if he couldn't work normal hours, he could find another job. When Marcus requested FMLA leave, Damien suggested he was faking symptoms to slack off. The words landed like physical blows. Damien felt Jessica shift beside him, putting fractional distance between their chairs. "That employee died in 2019, Clara continued, voice steady as concrete setting. "His obituary mentioned his early work in data security. It didn't mention the panic attacks he developed or the settlement that paid for his medical bills after we let him go. But I remember. I signed the check. Your Honor, this is completely irrelevant to the matter of—" Marcus tried. "It's relevant to pattern of behavior," Naomi said. "Mr. Cross has spent 15 years taking credit for work done by others, rewriting history to center himself, and expecting the people around him to maintain his fiction. Ms. Hayes did maintain it, for a while. She managed operations while he glad-handed clients. She fixed his mistakes while he collected accolades. She even let him tell people he'd founded the company alone when journalists got lazy with their fact-checking. Judge Hartfield was reading through the documents Naomi had provided, her expression settling into something that looked like controlled irritation. "Ms. Reed, I'm seeing corporate filings here that list Ms. Hayes as sole proprietor continuously from 2011 to present. I'm also seeing tax returns filed jointly that show Mr. Cross claiming business ownership. Those two things can't both be true." "You're correct, Your Honor. They can't. Which is why Ms. Hayes filed amended returns 3 weeks ago, with penalties paid, correcting the misrepresentation. The IRS has been notified. We expect they'll have questions for Mr. Cross about his claimed business deductions over the past decade." The air went out of the room. Damien felt it physically, That moment when the oxygen seems to evacuate and you're left gasping. Tax fraud. She was implying tax fraud, not directly. Too smart for that. But the implication hung there like smoke, impossible to ignore. "This is insane," Jessica hissed, loud enough that the stenographer glanced up. "Baby, she can't do this. Tell them she can't do this." But Damien had no words. The machinery of his thoughts had ground to a halt, jammed on the central impossible fact. Clara had outmaneuvered him. Clara, who'd spent 15 years being agreeable, accommodating, invisible. Who'd smiled at his jokes even when they weren't funny. Who'd hosted dinners for clients she found boring. Who'd moved through their marriage like someone playing a supporting role in someone else's story. Except she hadn't been. She'd been documenting, recording, building a case with the same methodical precision she'd applied to building their company. His company. Except it had never been his, had it? "Mr. Chen." Judge Hartfield's tone suggested her patience had limits and they were approaching them. "Does your client have documentation contradicting Ms. Reed's claims?" Marcus shuffled papers with the desperate energy of someone looking for a life raft on a sinking ship. "Your Honor, the practical reality is that Mr. Cross has operated as the company's CEO for over a decade. The board reports to him. Investors deal with him. The business community recognizes him as the face of a company his wife owns," Naomi finished. "Yes, very good branding, but being the public representative doesn't confer ownership, any more than being a movie star makes you the studio head." She pulled out another folder, this one marked with colored tabs. "If we want to talk about who actually runs Cross Digital, let's examine the operational decisions. Who approved the expansion into European markets in 2016? Ms. Hayes, according to board minutes. Who negotiated the licensing agreement with Siemens that became 30% of revenue? Ms. Hayes. Her signature is on the contract. Who stopped Mr. Cross from pursuing a disastrous merger with a competitor that would have violated antitrust regulations? Also Ms. Hayes, who had to explain basic Sherman Act provisions to her husband like he was a first-year law student." Damien's face burned. That merger would have been brilliant, revolutionary. Except Clara had brought in actual attorneys who'd explained in small words why it would have landed them in federal court. He'd been furious at the time, felt undermined, his vision constrained by her timidity. Now it looked different. Now it looked like she'd saved him from himself. "Your Honor, we object to this characterization of—" Marcus was drowning, and they both knew it. "On what grounds?" Naomi's eyebrow arched. "Facts? Because I have 12 years of board minutes, every major contract, financial statements showing Ms. Hayes' decision-making authority, and testimony from board members who understood perfectly well who actually owned the company, even if Mr. Cross preferred different optics." "Testimony," Marcus seized on the word. "Your Honor, we haven't been provided witness lists, haven't had opportunity to depose, because this was supposed to be an uncontested divorce," Naomi said. "Mr. Cross represented in his filings that asset division would be straightforward, per the prenuptial agreement. We're simply correcting his misunderstanding about which assets are actually his to divide." Judge Hartfield set down her pen. "I'm going to ask a very simple question, and I want a direct answer. Mr. Cross, did you or did you not transfer full ownership of Cross Digital Solutions to your wife in April 2011? Every eye in the courtroom turned to Damien. The three men in the back row, Volkov's people, had to be, sat perfectly still, watching with the detached interest of people observing an experiment they already knew the outcome of. The stenographer's fingers hovered. Jessica had gone pale, her earlier confidence evaporated like morning fog. And Clara just waited, hands folded on the table, while Adrian Volkov remained an unmoving presence beside her, saying nothing because nothing needed to be said. Damien's voice cracked. He cleared his throat, started again. "It was temporary. We both understood it was temporary. Did you execute any documentation formalizing that understanding?" the judge asked. "It was verbal. We were married. We trusted. So that's a no." Judge Hartfield made a note. "And in the 13 years since that transfer, did you at any point attempt to reverse it? File paperwork to reclaim ownership? Formalize any kind of agreement about the company's future?" Damien felt Marcus's warning hand on his arm. But the judge was waiting, and silence would be its own kind of confession. No, he admitted, but she never acted like she let me run everything. She signed whatever I put in front of her. She signed as the owner approving her CEO's decisions, Naomi said. That's literally how corporate hierarchy works, Mr. Cross. The owner has final say. She exercised it. She sat in the background. The words exploded out of him, volume rising despite Marcus's tightening grip. Every board meeting, every investor pitch, every decision, she deferred to me. She let me lead. She allowed you to perform your job as CEO, Naomi corrected, voice level, while she performed hers as owner and chairman. The fact that you confused her professionalism for passivity says more about your perception than her reality. Clara spoke then, and her voice had an edge he'd never heard before, something sharp enough to cut. I deferred to you because I thought we were partners, because I believed that letting you have the spotlight would make you happy, and your happiness mattered to me. I signed your documents because I trusted you were acting in the company's best interest. I stayed quiet in meetings because you told me investors preferred dealing with men. Did you forget that conversation, Damien? 2012, after the Redstone Capital pitch, when you said I should let you handle negotiations because those guys are old school, he had forgotten. The memory surfaced now like something dredged from a river, complete with the context he'd conveniently edited out. He'd wanted to close that deal himself, wanted the victory, and Clara's presence had felt like an asterisk on his accomplishment. You made yourself indispensable to my image, Clara continued, and I let you because I loved you and because I thought marriage meant supporting each other's strengths. I didn't realize you'd started believing your own mythology. This is very touching, Jessica cut in, her voice tight. But you can't seriously expect anyone to believe you've been the secret power behind everything all along. That's some kind of feminist revenge fantasy. Ms. Crane. Judge Hartfield's voice could have frozen nitrogen. You're not a party to this proceeding, and if you speak again without being addressed, I'll have you removed. Jessica's mouth snapped shut, 2 red spots appearing high on her cheeks. Naomi pulled out yet another document, and Damien felt a fresh wave of dread. How many folders did she have? How long had Clara been planning this? Your Honor, I'd like to submit testimony from Leonard Zhang, Cross Digital's CFO since 2013. She slid across what looked like a sworn affidavit, multiple pages, signed and notarized. Mr. Zhang states that all major financial decisions for the past 11 years went through Ms. Hayes for final approval. He reports directly to her on matters of capital allocation, investment strategy, and financial planning. Mr. Cross, as CEO, handles operational budgets and client relationships, but Ms. Hayes maintains ultimate authority over the company's financial direction. Marcus grabbed the document, skimmed it, and Damien watched his lawyer's expression shift from skepticism to barely concealed panic. I'd also like to submit testimony from Patricia Okoye, VP of Operations, who states that Ms. Hayes personally managed the company's operational infrastructure, HR policies, and legal compliance. Ms. Okoye notes that Mr. Cross was often uninvolved in these areas, preferring to focus on business development and client relations. Another affidavit, another nail. And testimony from Richard Castellano, board member since 2015, who confirms that board meetings list Ms. Hayes as chairman and that all major strategic decisions require her approval. The documents kept coming, a paper avalanche burying the story Damien had told himself, had told the world, had apparently come to believe despite all evidence to the contrary. Your Honor, we need time to review these statements, to cross-examine witnesses. Marcus was fighting now, but fighting from a position so weak it was almost cruel to watch. You'll have that opportunity if this proceeds to trial, Judge Hartfield said. But right now, I'm seeing a clear pattern. Ms. Reed, do you have more? Volumes more. Your Honor, but in the interest of time, let me jump to what I think will be the most illuminating piece. Naomi's smile was thin as a razor's edge. In January of this year, Mr. Cross began an extramarital relationship with Ms. Jessica Crane, then an intern at Cross Digital. Ms. Hayes became aware of this relationship in February when multiple employees reported inappropriate behavior. She did not at that time confront Mr. Cross. Instead, she began conducting an audit. Damien's stomach dropped through the floor. An audit, Naomi continued, of every major business decision Mr. Cross had made over the past 5 years. What she found was concerning. Mr. Cross had been using company resources for personal expenses, charging luxury hotels, expensive dinners, even Ms. Crane's rent to the corporate account. He'd approved raises for himself without board approval. He'd made promises to clients that the company couldn't keep, leaving Ms. Hayes' operations team to manage the fallout. That's standard CEO discretion, Marcus tried. It's embezzlement when you don't own the company, Naomi said flatly. Which Mr. Cross doesn't. Every dollar he spent from that corporate account without proper authorization was theft from Ms. Hayes. The word hung in the air like an accusation and a verdict combined. We're not pursuing criminal charges, Mom, Naomi added, almost as an afterthought. Yet, but the documentation exists should Ms. Hayes change her mind about leniency. Jessica made a small noise. Damien couldn't look at her, couldn't look at Clara, couldn't look at anything except the grain of the wooden table in front of him, the way the lines swirled and intersected, creating patterns that meant nothing, explained nothing, offered no escape. Furthermore, Naomi said, and the word carried the promise of more damage to come, Mr. Cross has been in preliminary discussions with venture capital firms about selling cross-digital solutions. These discussions began in March, before he filed for divorce, and involved misrepresenting himself as the sole owner authorized to negotiate a sale. She produced emails, printed and highlighted, time-stamped and damning. In this email to Apex Ventures, Mr. Cross writes, and I quote, "As founder and sole proprietor, I'm prepared to enter into exclusive negotiations for acquisition." He made similar representations to 3 other firms, including one that offered a preliminary valuation of $420 million. The number echoed through the courtroom. Damien heard Jessica's sharp inhale, knew exactly what she was thinking. That money, that life, the future they'd been planning in whispered conversations and late-night texts. Mr. Cross intended to sell a company he didn't own, Naomi said. Pocket the proceeds, divorce Ms. Hayes according to a prenuptial agreement that addressed none of the relevant assets, and leave her with whatever scraps he felt generous enough to provide. It's fraud on a spectacular scale. Your Honor, this is prosecutorial speculation. Marcus was standing now, color high, the veneer of professional calm finally cracking. It's documented fact, Naomi countered. Every email, every meeting, every misrepresentation, we have dates, times, witnesses. Mr. Cross has been systematically attempting to steal a company from his wife while pretending he was doing her a favor by offering a settlement. Judge Hartfield looked at Damien with an expression he couldn't quite read, disgust, maybe, or just exhaustion at the predictability of human nature. Mr. Cross, did you represent yourself to potential buyers as the owner of Cross Digital Solutions? The question was simple. The answer was impossible, because yes, he had. Of course he had. In his mind, in the story he'd constructed and maintained, he was the owner. He'd built the company from nothing, except it hadn't been nothing, had it? It had been Clara's thesis, Clara's money, Clara's quiet competence holding everything together while he chased glory. But admitting that now would make him, what? A liar? A thief? Someone so self-deluded he'd confused being the face of something with being the heart of it? I believed I had the authority, he said finally, words feeling like stones in his mouth. We built this together. You thought you could write your wife out of the story, Claire said, and there was something in her voice now that cut deeper than anger. Disappointment, maybe, or just the flat acknowledgement of facts too long avoided. You thought if you said it enough times, if you believed it hard enough, it would become true. That's not fair, he managed. I gave you everything, the house, the lifestyle, You gave me my own money, she interrupted, and called it generosity. The silence that followed felt infinite. Judge Hartfield cleared her throat. Ms. Reed, I assume you have a proposed resolution? Yes, Your Honor. It's quite simple, actually. Naomi's voice carried the satisfaction of someone playing a winning hand. Ms. Hayes is willing to allow the divorce to proceed amicably. However, since Cross Digital Solutions is her separate property, not marital property, there will be no division of that asset. Mr. Cross may keep his personal possessions, the watch collection, the car, any gifts or inheritances he received during the marriage. Ms. Hayes will retain the company, the brownstone, which she purchased before the marriage, and all associated assets. And Mr. Cross's settlement? The judge asked. We're prepared to offer him a severance package commensurate with his role as outgoing CEO. 6 months' salary, continuation of health benefits for 1 year, and a positive reference for future employment. In exchange, he signs a comprehensive NDA regarding company operations and agrees not to compete in the data security sector for 3 years. The words outgoing CEO landed like a physical blow. You're firing me, Damien said, the reality of it finally penetrating. You're taking the company and firing me. I'm accepting your resignation, Clara corrected. Given that you've been conducting yourself as though you were preparing to leave anyway, the severance is generous considering the alternative is prosecution for fraud and embezzlement. Marcus had gone very quiet, reading through the terms Naomi had slid across, and Damien could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. The legal fees a trial would cost, the discovery process that would excavate every questionable decision Damien had made, the publicity that would destroy whatever remained of his reputation. This is extortion, Jessica said, ignoring the judge's earlier warning. You can't force him to… Ms. Crane. Adrian Volkov's voice cut through the room for the first time, and it was remarkable how much authority could be packed into 3 syllables. He hadn't moved, hadn't changed expression, but the temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. You should be quiet now. It wasn't a threat. Somehow that made it more terrifying, just a statement of fact, delivered in an accent that carried the weight of experience with consequences. Jessica shut up. Volkov's attention shifted to Damien, and those cold eyes held something that might have been amusement, or might have been contempt, or might have been both. Your lawyer is going to tell you to take the deal, Volkov said, conversational, almost friendly. Because he's smart enough to recognize when his client has no leverage. You should listen to him. Mr. Volkov, Judge Hartfield began, but he raised one hand slightly, not dismissive, just acknowledging. Apologies, Your Honor. I'll save any further commentary for outside the courtroom. But the message had been delivered. Whatever resources Damien had imagined he could marshal, whatever connections he thought might save him, they paled beside the kind of power sitting next to Clara. Old power, the kind that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. Marcus leaned close, voice barely a whisper. Damien, we need to talk. Outside. Now. I'm not leaving, Damien hissed back. I'm not letting her. You don't have a choice. Marcus's grip on his arm was tight enough to bruise. The documents are real. The witnesses are real. If this goes to trial, you lose everything and probably face criminal charges. The severance offer is a gift. Take it. It's my company, Damien said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. It was never your company, Marcus said flatly. That's the whole point. You've been living in a fantasy for 13 years, and she just woke you up. Judge Hartfield was watching this exchange with the tired expression of someone who'd seen this exact scene play out in 1,000 variations. Mr. Chen, does your client need more time to consider the settlement terms? Marcus looked at Damien, and in his eyes, Damien saw the future. Depositions where every questionable decision would be examined, testimony from employees who'd watched him take credit for Clara's work, emails to potential buyers that would look like fraud in black and white, trial coverage that would destroy his reputation, criminal referrals, or he could sign papers, take the money, and walk away. Yes, Marcus said. We need to discuss this privately. You have 15 minutes, the judge said. There's a conference room down the hall. The walk to the conference room felt like a perp walk, everyone watching, everyone knowing he'd lost before the fight had even started. Jessica followed, heels clicking accusation on the tile floor, and he could feel her unraveling beside him, could sense the recalculation happening as she understood that the future she'd been promised had evaporated. The conference room was generic, white walls, fake wood table, windows that overlooked an air shaft, and nothing else. Marcus closed the door and turned on Damien with barely controlled fury. What the hell were you thinking? His professional veneer had completely dissolved. You transferred ownership of a multi-million-dollar company and never documented an agreement to reverse it? You ran around telling potential buyers you owned a company registered in your wife's name. You charged your mistress's rent to the corporate account? She never objected, Damien said weakly. Clara signed everything because she was building a case. Marcus was actually yelling now, voice bouncing off the walls. She was letting you hang yourself, documenting every instance of fraud, every misrepresentation, and you arrogant idiot, you walked right into it because you couldn't imagine a world where your wife was smarter than you. The words hit like a series of slaps. Jessica had her phone out, scrolling with increasing urgency. There's nothing about this online. No articles about Clara Hayes, no, because she's been invisible by choice, Marcus snapped. That's what Naomi was trying to tell you in there. Clara let Damien play CEO while she actually ran the company, and everyone who mattered knew it. Board members, investors, executives, they all knew who really owned Cross Digital. The only people who didn't know were the general public, and apparently Clara's own husband. So what do we do? Damien heard the desperation in his own voice and hated it. We take the deal, Marcus said immediately. We take it, and we thank whatever higher power you believe in that she's not pressing charges, because she could, Damien. Embezzlement, fraud, a dozen financial crimes, she has you dead to rights. 6 months' salary is nothing, Jessica protested. The company's worth hundreds of millions. The company is worth exactly zero to him because it's not his. Marcus turned on her with barely concealed contempt. You want to know what he actually owns? A Rolex collection, a Mercedes, and whatever's left in his personal checking account after paying my fees. That's it. Everything else, the penthouse, the company car, the expense account, that was all her money. He's been spending his wife's money and calling it success. The truth of it settled over Damien like a weight. He thought about the penthouse they'd moved into 3 years ago, the one with the view of Central Park that he'd insisted on. Clara had signed the lease. He thought about the Tesla in the garage, the membership at the Manhattan Athletic Club, the tailored suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. All of it charged to accounts Clara controlled, approved with her signature, her money funding the lifestyle he'd pointed to as evidence of his own success. He'd been rich, all right, rich on his wife's fortune while believing he'd earned it himself. What about the investors, he asked, grasping for something. The board? They expect the owner to make decisions about leadership, Marcus interrupted. And the owner has decided. You're out. Through the small window in the door, Damien could see back toward the courtroom. Clara and Naomi stood in the hallway, talking quietly, and beside them, Volkov leaned against the wall with the casual confidence of someone who'd never doubted the outcome. Clara laughed at something Naomi said, and the sound carried down the hall, genuine, unforced, nothing like the polite laughter she'd offered at his jokes for 15 years. She looked free. I could fight this, Damien said, but there was no conviction behind it. You could, Marcus agreed. You'd lose, but you could fight. It would cost you everything you have left in legal fees, and at the end you'd still walk away with nothing except a criminal record. Or you can sign the papers, take the severance, and try to salvage whatever pieces of your life remain. Jessica was quiet now, staring at her phone like it might provide an escape hatch from reality. Damien watched her profile, the careful makeup, the calculated beauty, and wondered what she saw when she looked at him now. Not a successful CEO, not a future husband with a fortune to share. Just a middle-aged man who'd mistaken his wife's generosity for his own genius and lost everything when she stopped pretending. If I sign, he said slowly, what happens to her? What happens to Clara? Marcus blinked. She continues running the company she's been running all along. Probably announces you're stepping down to pursue other opportunities. The business doesn't miss a beat because you were never as essential as you thought you were. And Volkov? What about him? Why is he here? What's his angle? Marcus shrugged. Maybe he's exactly what he appears to be. Her fiancé, supporting her through a difficult situation. Maybe he's an investor protecting his interests. Maybe he just likes watching arrogant men learn lessons. Does it matter? It didn't, Damien supposed. The why of it was less important than the what. Clara had moved on, found someone new, someone powerful enough that even being in the same room with him felt like a warning. How long do we have? He asked. 10 more minutes before the judge expects an answer. Marcus's voice had lost its edge, settling into something that almost resembled pity. Damien, I've been doing this for 20 years. I've seen people fight battles they couldn't win out of pride, out of stubbornness, out of inability to accept reality. They always lose. And they always pay more than they would have if they'd been smart enough to fold early. Don't be that guy. Jessica finally spoke. If he signs, what about us? Both men looked at her. What about you? Marcus asked, and there was something brutal in the question. We were going to, he said after the divorce. She stumbled over the words, reality intruding on whatever fantasies she'd been sold. He has 6 months' salary and whatever's in his savings, Marcus said bluntly. No company, no executive position, no real job prospects given that he's about to be fired from the only company he's ever run and can't work in his own industry for 3 years. Still interested? The silence was answer enough. Damien watched Jessica's face close down, watched her mentally calculating the math of staying versus leaving, and saw the exact moment she chose her own survival over whatever they'd had together. It was remarkable, really, how quickly affection could evaporate when the bank account did. I need some air, she said, already moving toward the door. Jessica, don't. She didn't look back. Just don't. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like an ending. Marcus gathered his papers. She's not coming back. I know. The settlement is fair, more than fair, given the circumstances. I know that too. Then sign the papers, go home, and figure out what comes next. Marcus's voice gentled slightly. For what it's worth, I am sorry. I know this isn't the outcome you wanted. Damien laughed, and it came out bitter. I wanted to celebrate my freedom with champagne on the courthouse steps. I wanted Clara to understand she'd lost me. You wanted to be the hero of this story, Marcus finished. But you were always just the supporting character. She was just too kind to tell you. They walked back to the courtroom in silence. Clara and Naomi had returned to their seats. Volkov remained exactly where he'd been, unmoved and unmovable. Jessica's chair sat empty, purse gone, no note, just the vacancy where confidence used to be. Judge Hartfield looked up as they entered. Mr. Chen, my client accepts the settlement terms, Your Honor. Damien thought he should feel something, rage, grief, the sharp pain of loss. Instead, he just felt tired and small, and suddenly aware of how much energy he'd spent maintaining an illusion that had never been real in the first place. Naomi slid the papers across. He read them without really seeing the words, the legalese blurring together into a document that meant he was agreeing to walk away from everything he thought he'd built. His hand shook slightly as he signed. Clara didn't watch him do it. She was looking at Volkov, saying something too quiet to hear, and he responded with a slight nod that seemed to contain entire conversations. The court accepts the settlement agreement, Judge Hartfield said. The marriage of Damien Cross and Clara Hayes Cross is hereby dissolved. All terms as stipulated have been entered into the record. You're both free to go. Just like that, 15 years ended with the scratch of pen on paper. Damien stood, muscles stiff from sitting too long in one position, and made the mistake of looking at Clara one more time. She met his eyes, and he searched for something there, anger, triumph, vindication, but found only a kind of weary relief. I hope you find what you're looking for, she said quietly. I really do. It was worse than anger would have been, worse than gloating, because it was sincere, and that sincerity underscored just how thoroughly she'd moved past him. He walked out of the courtroom alone, the champagne bottle still waiting in his driver's car, an artifact from a celebration that would never happen. The hallway stretched out in front of him, fluorescent and infinite, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the click of Jessica's heels getting farther away. Behind him, he heard Clara's voice, lighter now. Thank you, Naomi, for everything. You did the hard part, Naomi replied. I just made sure the paperwork was in order. Volkov's low rumble. Dinner tonight? There's a place in Brooklyn you'll like. Clara, that sounds perfect. The sounds of people with plans, with futures, with lives that would continue unfolding long after this moment faded into memory. Damien kept walking. The champagne bottle sat on the passenger seat of the Mercedes, like evidence at a crime scene. Damien stared at it through the windshield, keys heavy in his hand, unable to make himself open the door. His driver had left it there as instructed, ready for the celebration that was supposed to happen, the triumphant moment that was supposed to mark his liberation. Instead, he'd walked out of that courthouse with nothing but a severance package and the slowly crystallizing understanding that he'd been living someone else's life for over a decade. His phone buzzed. A text from Jessica. "I'm sorry, I can't do this. Good luck." 3 sentences to end 6 months. He supposed he should appreciate the efficiency. At least she'd bothered to send a message instead of just disappearing into whatever future she'd already started planning. He wondered how long it would take her to update her dating profiles, to scrub mentions of him from her social media, to rewrite the story she'd been telling, where she was the girlfriend of a tech CEO instead of the mistress of an unemployed fraud. Another text, this one from a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Cross, this is Patricia Okoye from Cross Digital. We need to discuss transition procedures. When can you come by to collect your personal effects?" Personal effects. Like he was being evicted. Which he supposed he was. He started typing a response, then deleted it. Started again. Deleted again. What was there to say? "Sure, I'll swing by to grab my coffee mug and the photo of me shaking hands with the mayor that was actually your company, not mine." The phone rang. "Marcus." "Don't answer," Damien muttered to himself, but his thumb betrayed him. "You need to come back to the office," Marcus said without preamble. "We need to go through the settlement line by line. Make sure you understand the non-compete clause, the NDA provisions. I'm not signing anything else today." "Damien, you already signed. Now, we need to make sure you don't violate the terms by accident. The NDA is comprehensive. You can't talk to press, can't post on social media about the company, can't even mention Clara's name in a professional context without potential breach." She really thought of everything, didn't she? Marcus sighed, and the sound carried the weight of every difficult client conversation he'd ever had. She had a good lawyer and 13 years to prepare. You had 6 months of thinking with something other than your brain. Do the math. That's not, "I don't care what it is or isn't. I care about making sure you don't do something stupid that voids your severance and lands you in actual legal jeopardy. So get your ass to my office in the next hour, or I'm billing you for another full day of work you can't afford." The line went dead. Damien sat in the parking garage, surrounded by the concrete and exhaust smell of Manhattan underground living, and tried to remember when he'd last made a decision that hadn't imploded in his face. The affair with Jessica, disaster. The attempted sale of the company, catastrophic. The assumption that Clara would just roll over and accept whatever terms he offered, possibly the biggest miscalculation of his life. When did he become this person? The kind of man who charged his mistress's rent to his wife's company? Who told potential investors he owned something that had never been his? Who walked into divorce court with champagne and walked out with nothing? The answer came with uncomfortable clarity, gradually, then all at once. Small compromises, little lies. The steady erosion of boundaries he'd once thought were fixed. Taking credit for Clara's operational work because clients responded better to him. Signing his name alone on articles about the company's founding because it made for a cleaner narrative. Believing his own press releases until the fiction became indistinguishable from fact in his own mind. He'd been so certain he was the architect of his own success. Turned out he'd just been the spokesperson, reading someone else's script. His phone buzzed again. This time it was an email notification from HR at Cross Digital. Subject line: separation agreement and Cobra benefits information. They were already processing his termination. Efficient, professional, exactly how Clara would want it handled. No drama, no scene, just clean corporate procedure executed by people who probably had no idea they'd just fired the man whose name was literally on the building. Except it wasn't his name on the building, was it? It was hers. Hayes Cross Technologies, originally. She'd let him rebrand it to Cross Digital in 2010, and he'd thought that was her acknowledging his leadership, his vision. Now it looked different. Looked like her giving him enough rope to hang himself while she quietly maintained control of the actual assets. Damien finally opened the car door, leaving the champagne behind. Let someone else find it. Let the parking attendant wonder what celebration had been canceled, what victory had turned to ash. Marcus's office was in Midtown, all glass and steel and the kind of minimalist design that screamed, "We bill by the quarter hour, and we're worth it." The receptionist recognized him, offered the same professional smile she probably gave everyone, and gestured toward the conference room without being told. Marcus was already there, documents spread across the table like casualties of war. "Sit," he said, not looking up. "We're going to go through this section by section, and you're going to actually listen this time, instead of just assuming you know better than everyone else." Damien sat. The non-compete clause prohibits you from working in enterprise data security for 36 months. That's starting from today, not from when you actually leave the building. You cannot consult, cannot advise, cannot even informally help a friend who asks questions about the industry. Violation triggers repayment of the entire severance plus penalties. 3 years is excessive. 3 years is what you agreed to when you signed the papers 90 minutes ago. You want to renegotiate? Go back to that courtroom and see how sympathetic Judge Hartfield is to your concerns. Marcus's voice was flat. The NDA covers all proprietary information, all client relationships, all internal operations. You cannot write a memoir. You cannot give interviews. You cannot even correct people who repeat the false narrative about you founding the company, because addressing it would violate the confidentiality provisions. So I'm just supposed to let people think, yes? That's exactly what you're supposed to do, because the alternative is Clara suing you for breach. And trust me, after what I saw in that courtroom, she has the documentation to make your life a living hell if you give her a reason. Damien slumped in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. Through the window, Manhattan stretched out in its relentless grid, millions of people conducting their lives with the certainty that they understood their own stories. "What about the severance payments?" he asked. "When do those start?" "First payment hits your account in 30 days. After that, monthly installments for 6 months, contingent on your compliance with all settlement terms. Miss a single provision of the NDA, the payments stop, and you owe back everything you've received." 6 months of his salary, which sounded generous until he did the math. 950,000 divided by 12 times 6. Just under $500,000, before taxes. Enough to live on for a while if he was careful, but nowhere near the fortune he'd thought he was walking away with. The penthouse lease is in Clara's name, has been since you moved in. You have 30 days to vacate. My car, company car, registered to Cross Digital. You can keep it for 2 weeks, then it goes back. The club membership, also company expense, revoked effective immediately. Each answer was another piece of his life peeling away, revealing the empty space underneath. He'd been living in a house of cards, and Clara had just removed the bottom row. "What about my stock options?" Marcus actually laughed, short and bitter. "You don't have stock options. You can't have options in a company you don't work for and never owned. What you had was a performance bonus structure that Clara approved annually as part of your compensation package. That ended when your employment ended. There has to be something." "There is something. There's the severance money, which is more than most people see in years of work. There's no criminal charges, which is more mercy than you probably deserve. And there's the knowledge that you're walking away from this with your freedom and your reputation mostly intact, assuming you're smart enough to keep your mouth shut." Marcus started gathering the documents. "I'm serious about that last part, Damien. One interview, one social media post, one conversation with the journalist, it all goes away. Clara's lawyers will be watching." The image of Naomi Reed watching, waiting for him to slip up, was somehow more intimidating than the thought of Adrian Volkov's cold assessment. "What about—" Damien stopped, not sure how to phrase the question. "What about what?" "Volkov. Who is he really? What's his connection to Clara?" Marcus looked at him like he'd asked what color the sky was. "Does it matter? I just want to understand. You want to understand how your ex-wife moved on so fast? How she found someone who makes you look like a middle manager at a struggling startup?" Marcus's patience had clearly run out. "Here's what I know. Adrian Volkov has the kind of money and connections that make people nervous. Clara apparently met him through some business function 6 months ago. They got engaged 3 weeks ago, around the same time you filed for divorce. Whether that's coincidence or strategy, I couldn't tell you. 6 months ago, right when she would have discovered the affair with Jessica, started the audit, begun building her case. She planned this, Damien said. All of it. The engagement, the timing, everything. Of course she planned it. She's smart, she was motivated, and she had resources. What did you plan, Damien? Besides celebrating a divorce you hadn't even finalized yet? The question sat between them, unanswerable. Marcus stood, signaling the meeting was over. My advice? Take the money, find a new career outside your non-compete, and consider this an expensive lesson in not taking people for granted, especially people who own things you think you own. Damien left the office feeling hollowed out, carved empty by the steady accumulation of losses. The elevator descended through 40 floors of other people's lives, lawyers and consultants and executives who still believed in their own narratives, who hadn't yet had their certainties stripped away in a courtroom. On the street, Manhattan moved around him with indifferent energy. Tourists taking photos, professionals rushing between meetings, delivery drivers navigating the chaos. None of them knew or cared that his entire existence had just been revealed as a lie. The anonymity should have been comforting. Instead, it just emphasized how small he was, how replaceable. His phone rang again, a number he recognized. Richard Castellano, board member at Cross Digital, the man whose testimony Naomi had cited. Richard, Damien answered, trying to sound normal. Damien, I wanted to reach out personally. Richard's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone navigating political waters. I heard about the settlement. I'm sorry things ended this way. Are you? The bitterness leaked through despite his best effort. Actually, yes. Whatever else happened, you did good work for the company. The client relationships you built, the deals you closed, that was real. But not enough to keep my job. The job was never yours to keep. Richard sighed. Look, I know this is rough, but Clara gave you more chances than most people would have. The expense account irregularities, the misrepresentations to investors. She could have fired you years ago. She didn't because she kept hoping you'd remember who you were before you started believing your own hype. When did you know? Damien asked. That she actually owned everything? From the beginning. Everyone on the board knew. It was in all the paperwork, every filing, every shareholder agreement. The only person who seemed confused about the ownership structure was you. The words landed like physical blows. Everyone knew. The board, the investors, probably half the executive team, they'd all known he was playing dress-up as CEO while his wife actually ran the company. And they'd let him keep pretending because it was easier than dealing with his ego. Why didn't anyone say anything? Because Clara asked us not to. She said you needed to feel like you were leading, that it was important for your confidence, for the company culture. Richard paused. I told her at the time it was a mistake, that letting you live in a fantasy would end badly. Looks like I was right. Damien found himself on a bench in Bryant Park, phone still pressed to his ear, watching people enjoy their lunch breaks like the world was still a place where things made sense. What happens now? He asked. To the company? Clara's announcing your departure tomorrow, framed as a mutual decision, pursuing new opportunities. All the usual corporate language. She's already named Patricia Okoye as interim CEO while they conduct a formal search. What? Patricia. The VP of operations who'd given testimony about Clara managing the actual business infrastructure. Of course. And the company will be fine, Richard continued. Better than fine, probably. Clara's been the operational backbone for years. Now she won't have to work around you to get things done. I wasn't that bad. You charged your mistress's rent to the company account, Damien. You tried to sell a company you didn't own. You were exactly that bad. You just had someone cleaning up your messes who was so good at it you never noticed. The line went quiet for a moment, and Damien could hear traffic in the background on Richard's end, the ambient sound of a life continuing normally. For what it's worth, Richard said finally, I hope you land on your feet. Learn from this. Find something new. You're not a bad guy. You're just a guy who lost the plot for a while. It happens. Does it? Does this happen to other people? The specifics are unique, but the pattern, man gets successful, starts believing he did it alone, forgets about the people who actually built the foundation. That's practically a cliché. You're just the latest version. Richard hung up, and Damien sat on the bench for a long time, watching pigeons fight over someone's abandoned sandwich. His phone buzzed with a calendar reminder. Dinner reservation at Daniel, 8 p.m., party of two. He'd made it weeks ago, planning to take Jessica out to celebrate the divorce. $800 for tasting menus and wine pairings, charged to a credit card that was probably linked to a company account he no longer had access to. He canceled the reservation. The afternoon bled into evening, the spring light fading as office workers started their commutes home. Damien watched them go and wondered what came next. No job, no girlfriend, no apartment in 2 weeks. A bank account that would be comfortable for a while but wouldn't last forever, especially not at the spending level he'd become accustomed to. He could go back to sales, maybe. Find some tech company that needed someone with client relationship experience, except the non-compete meant he couldn't work in his actual field of expertise, and who was going to hire a 42-year-old former CEO with a gap in his resume and no real accomplishments he could claim without violating his NDA. The future stretched out, uncertain and diminished, nothing like the story he'd been telling himself. His phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from the building management of his penthouse. Notice of lease termination and move-out procedures. They weren't wasting time. Claire must have contacted them immediately after the settlement was signed, triggering whatever corporate tenant provisions existed. Professional. Efficient. Exactly her style. No anger, no vindictiveness, just systematic dismantling of the life he'd thought was his. Damien stood, joints stiff from sitting too long, and started walking with no particular destination. His feet carried him south, toward Brooklyn, following some muscle memory of routes he used to walk when he and Clara were first starting out. The old neighborhood looked different now, gentrified, expensive, the cheap Thai place where they used to eat replaced by an organic juice bar. But some things remained. The bodega on the corner where they'd bought beer and lottery tickets, the park where they'd sometimes walk late at night, talking about the future, planning the empire they'd build together. Except they hadn't built it together, had they? She'd built it while he took credit. He found himself on the block where their first apartment had been, back when Cross Digital was still Hayes Cross Technologies, and they were surviving on ramen and determination. The building looked smaller than he remembered, shabbier. Hard to believe they'd once thought this was the center of the universe, that everything important happened within these four walls. Claire used to work at the kitchen table, laptop surrounded by notepads and coffee cups, managing their tiny team while he was out pitching clients. He'd come home pumped up from closing a deal, and she'd have the operations report ready, revenue projections, expense tracking, the boring infrastructure work that kept everything running. He thought she was handling the paperwork while he built the business. Now he saw it differently. She was building the business while he handled sales. He'd been an employee from the start, just too arrogant to realize it. His phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Mr. Cross? A woman's voice, professional, unfamiliar. Speaking. This is Jennifer Wu from Tech Weekly. I'm working on a story about leadership transitions in enterprise software, and I understand you're stepping down from Cross Digital Solutions. I was hoping to get a comment. No comment. He hung up before she could finish. The NDA. Already someone was digging, looking for the story behind the story. He wondered what they'd find, what narrative would emerge. Tech CEO steps down to pursue new opportunities? Or would someone dig deeper, find the divorce filing, start asking questions about who really owned what? He couldn't control the story anymore. Maybe he never could. Another text, this one from a name he hadn't seen in years. David Park, an old college friend who'd gone into finance. Saw the news about Cross Digital. You okay? Want to grab a drink? News traveled fast. The announcement wouldn't be official until tomorrow, but people talked, people noticed. By this time next week, everyone in his professional circle would know he'd been fired. Some would reach out with sympathy. Others would quietly remove him from their networks, calculating that he was no longer useful to know. Damien typed back, "Rain check. Dealing with some things." David responded immediately. "Heard about the divorce too. That's rough, man. Let me know if you need anything." The sympathy was genuine, Damien could tell, but it also came from a place of distance, of someone who'd already moved on to different circles, different concerns. They'd been close once, back when the future was unlimited and they were all going to conquer the world together. Now David was a managing director at Goldman Sachs, and Damien was unemployed with a non-compete clause and rapidly diminishing prospects. The sky had gone full dark, street lights flickering on across Brooklyn. Damien realized he'd been walking for hours, his feet aching in shoes that cost $600 and were designed for looking impressive in boardrooms, not actual walking. He caught a cab back to the penthouse, sitting in traffic while the driver listened to talk radio in a language Damien didn't recognize. The normalcy of it felt surreal. Just another Wednesday night, another fare, nothing special about the passenger in the back seat whose entire life had collapsed between breakfast and dinner. The penthouse felt different when he walked in. Or maybe he felt different, and the space just reflected it. Every piece of furniture, every bit of art on the walls, every expensive appliance in the kitchen, it had all been purchased with Clara's money, approved by Clara's taste, chosen for a life they were supposed to be building together. He'd thought he was generous, letting her decorate however she wanted. Now it looked different. She'd been decorating her own apartment, and he'd been a guest who didn't realize he was temporary. In the bedroom, her closet stood empty. She must have moved her things out while he was at the courthouse, another efficient operation executed while he was busy learning how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. His own clothes hung alone now, expensive suits and Italian shoes that suddenly seemed like costumes for a role he was no longer playing. Damien poured himself a drink, Scotch, 25-year-old single malt that Clara had given him for his 40th birthday. He'd made a joke about finally having expensive taste now that he could afford it. She'd smiled and said nothing, probably doing the mental math of her money buying him a gift he thought he'd earned. The Scotch tasted like regret. His phone lit up with another notification. An email from Cross Digital IT. Account deactivation notice. Wait. They were revoking his email access, his login credentials, his entire digital existence within the company. By tomorrow morning, it would be like he'd never worked there at all. Systematic, professional, exactly how Clara would want it done. Damien carried his drink to the window, looking out over Manhattan's glittering expanse. Somewhere out there, Clara was having dinner with Adrian Volkov, probably laughing about something, making plans for a future that had nothing to do with the man she'd spent 15 years married to. And somewhere out there, Jessica was already moving on, updating her profiles, adjusting her story, finding the next guy who could give her the lifestyle she wanted. And somewhere out there, 100 people who used to return his calls were quietly downgrading his importance, removing him from contact lists, deciding he was no longer worth the effort of maintaining a relationship. He'd built his entire identity on being Damien Cross, CEO, founder, success story. Without those labels, who was he? Just a guy in an expensive apartment he had to vacate in 30 days, drinking scotch he couldn't afford to replace, waiting for severance payments that would run out in 6 months. The truth settled over him like gravity. He'd been living someone else's life, and now he had to figure out what his own life actually looked like. It wasn't going to be glamorous. It wasn't going to make for good cocktail party conversations. It wasn't going to involve champagne celebrations or magazine profiles or the admiration of people who only cared about him when he was useful. It was just going to be his, whatever that meant. Damien finished the scotch and set the empty glass on the counter. Outside, the city continued its relentless operation, indifferent to his revelation, unmoved by his fall. Tomorrow, he'd start figuring out what came next. Tonight, he'd just sit with the wreckage and try to understand how he'd mistaken someone else's generosity for his own genius, someone else's success for his own achievement, someone else's patience for permanent permission. The apartment was quiet except for the ambient hum of expensive appliances and central air, all the sounds of a life that had never really been his. Morning came whether Damien was ready for it or not. Sunlight cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows with the kind of aggressive brightness that felt personal, invasive. He'd fallen asleep on the couch sometime around 3, still wearing yesterday's clothes, the empty scotch glass tipped over on the coffee table. His phone showed 47 missed notifications. Email, texts, LinkedIn messages, the digital equivalent of vultures circling. He scrolled through without opening any of them, recognizing the pattern: former colleagues expressing concern, competitors feigning sympathy, a handful of genuine friends buried somewhere in the noise. One text stood out, sent at 6:47 a.m. from Patricia Okoye. Company-wide announcement goes out at 9. Wanted you to hear it from me first. Press release attached. I'm sorry, Damien. He opened the attachment with the kind of dread usually reserved for medical test results. The press release was a masterclass in corporate diplomacy. Damian Cross stepping down to pursue new opportunities after 15 years of dedicated service. Clara Hayes Cross assuming direct operational control, having served as chairman and principal owner throughout the company's history. Gratitude for Damian's contributions to client relationships and business development. Patricia Okoye named interim CEO. All very professional, very clean, completely devoid of any truth that mattered. The comments beneath Patricia's text were already starting to appear as people shared the news. Former employees weighing in, industry analysts speculating, the slow-motion car crash of his reputation playing out in real time across social media. Wow, end of an era, someone wrote. Surprised it took this long TBH, another replied. Everyone knew Clara was the real brains behind Cross Digital. Anyone else notice the timing with his divorce? Messy. Heard he was having an affair with an intern. Classy. The story was writing itself, and Damian was powerless to correct it. The NDA meant he couldn't defend himself, couldn't explain, couldn't even acknowledge that the narrative people were constructing bore only passing resemblance to reality. Except reality was worse than they knew. Reality was that he hadn't been pushed out after 15 years of dedicated service. He'd been an employee playing CEO while his wife let him pretend. And the moment he'd pushed too far, she'd simply reminded him of facts that had been true all along. His phone rang. Marcus Chen, probably calling to make sure he wasn't doing anything stupid like posting on Twitter or calling journalists. I'm not violating the NDA, Damian said instead of hello. Good. Keep it that way. The press release is out in... Marcus paused, probably checking his watch. 90 seconds. Your phone's about to explode. Don't answer anyone unless I've cleared them first. What am I supposed to do? Just sit here while everyone tears me apart online? Yes, that's exactly what you're supposed to do. Let them speculate. Let them create whatever narrative they want. Your job is to stay silent, collect your severance, and not give Clara's lawyers any reason to void the agreement. This is insane. This is consequences. Marcus's voice had no sympathy left. You had an affair with a subordinate, tried to sell a company you didn't own, and spent years taking credit for someone else's work. People finding out about it isn't insane. It's inevitable. Be grateful Clara's being discreet about the details. The line went dead. At exactly 9 a.m., Damian's phone started vibrating like it was having a seizure. Calls, texts, emails, all flooding in at once as the announcement propagated through industry networks. He watched the notifications pile up, each one a small monument to his rapidly disintegrating reputation. A call from his mother, he let it go to voicemail. A text from his brother. What the hell happened? Another from David Park. Just saw the news. Seriously, call me. LinkedIn messages from recruiters who'd spent years courting him, now probably repositioning their pitches from executive placement to damage control. And buried in the avalanche, a single text from a number he didn't recognize. You should have taken better care of what you had. A friend. The message felt vaguely threatening, though Damian couldn't identify anything specific to point to. Just the tone, the implication that someone was watching, someone who knew more than the public narrative suggested. He tried to trace the number, but it came back as a burner phone, untraceable. Probably one of Volkov's people, he decided. A little reminder that powerful men had long memories and extensive reach. The apartment felt smaller suddenly, walls closing in. Damian grabbed his keys and left, needing movement, needing air, needing anything other than sitting in Clara's penthouse watching his professional death play out in real time. Outside, Manhattan operated with its usual indifference. Nobody recognized him. Nobody cared. He was just another guy in expensive clothes walking too fast down Fifth Avenue, and the anonymity was both relief and indictment. His feet carried him toward Cross Digital's headquarters without conscious decision, muscle memory, maybe, or just the pull of familiar territory. The building loomed in its glass and steel glory, the company logo prominent above the entrance. He'd walked through those doors 1,000 times, always with the confidence of ownership, of belonging. Now he stood across the street like a tourist, like someone who'd never been inside. Through the lobby windows, he could see the morning rush, employees badging in, grabbing coffee from the cart in the atrium, heading to elevators that would carry them to jobs they still had. He recognized some faces. Linda from accounting, Marcus Hall's replacement, whose name he'd never bothered to learn. A cluster of developers arguing about something, probably code, probably important to them in ways he'd never understood. His phone buzzed. Patricia Okoye calling. He answered this time. Patricia? Damien, hi. I know this is awkward, but we need to schedule a time for you to collect your personal items. HR is asking when you'll be available. You couldn't have just emailed this? I could have. She paused, and he heard genuine regret in her voice. But I wanted to say I'm sorry. I know you don't believe this, but I actually am. Whatever else happened, you did build some real relationships here. People are going to miss you. But not enough to, speak up? Tell Clara she was being too harsh? Claire's not being harsh, Damien. She's being fair. More than fair, actually, considering she could have pressed charges for the expense account fraud alone. The word fraud landed like a punch. It wasn't fraud. You had authority as CEO to make business expenditures, not personal ones. Your girlfriend's rent wasn't a business expense. The vacation you charged to the company account last month wasn't a business expense. Fine. He cut her off, unable to hear more. When does HR want me to come by? They suggested tomorrow, early, before most people arrive. Less awkward for everyone. Less awkward for everyone. As if there was a way to make this not excruciating. I'll be there at 7, he said. Thank you. And Damien, for what it's worth, I hope you land somewhere good. You're talented at what you do. Client relationships, business development, that's real skill. You just need to do it somewhere without the baggage. She hung up before he could formulate a response. Talented at what you do. As if that was consolation. As if being good at sales made up for the systematic dismantling of his entire identity. Damien turned away from the building and kept walking. No destination in mind, just movement for movement's sake. He passed the coffee shop where he used to grab espresso before morning meetings. The restaurant where he'd closed the Siemens deal. Except it wasn't his deal, was it? Clara had negotiated the actual terms while he'd handled the relationship management. Every landmark in his professional life was revealed as hollow when examined closely. Every achievement had an asterisk, a footnote, a quiet truth about who'd actually done the work while he took the credit. His phone rang again. This time it was a number he recognized, Tom Bradford, an old college friend who'd gone into consulting. Tom, Damien answered, because ignoring everyone was starting to feel like cowardice. Jesus Christ, man. I just saw the announcement. Are you okay? Define okay. Fair point. Tom's voice carried the awkwardness of someone who wanted to help but had no idea how. Listen, I know this is probably the last thing you want to think about right now, but if you're looking for work, my firm might have some opportunities. Business development, client relations, that's your wheelhouse, right? I have a 3-year non-compete in enterprise data security. Okay, but consulting is different. We work across sectors, retail, healthcare, finance. None of that should trigger your non-compete. The offer was genuine, Damien could tell, but it also came with the implicit understanding that he'd be starting over, coming in at a level below where he'd been, rebuilding credibility from scratch. I appreciate it, he said carefully. Can I think about it? Everything's kind of chaotic right now. Of course, no pressure. Just wanted you to know the offer's there. Tom hesitated. For real though, are you okay? The rumor mill is going crazy about what actually happened. What are people saying? That you got caught embezzling, that the affair with your assistant was sexual harassment, that Claire's been running the company the whole time and you were basically a figurehead. Tom paused. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, right? The truth is worse than you think and different than you're imagining, Damien said. But I can't talk about it. NDA. Shit, okay. Well, the offer stands. And if you need to grab a drink and just vent about anything except the specifics, I'm around. After Tom hung up, Damien stood on a street corner watching traffic lights cycle through their patterns, red to green to yellow to red again, the mechanical certainty of systems that operated according to fixed rules. He envied the simplicity of it. A woman walked past, designer handbag, power suit, the whole armor of corporate success. She was talking on her phone, voice sharp with authority. Tell them if they can't meet the deadline, we'll find someone who can. I don't care about their excuses. Results matter, not explanations. She reminded him of himself, or the version of himself he'd been performing for years. Confident, demanding, utterly certain of her own importance. He wondered if she actually had the authority she was projecting, or if she was doing what he'd done, borrowing credibility from someone else's foundation and calling it her own. His phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line made his stomach drop. Interview request, New York Times business section. He deleted it without reading. Another email, this one from a blogger who covered tech industry drama. Delete. A LinkedIn message from someone claiming to be writing a book about corporate fraud. Delete and block. The attention was metastasizing, growing beyond the initial announcement into something that would take on its own life. By next week, there would be think pieces about toxic masculinity in tech. By next month, case studies in business school ethics courses. His name would become shorthand for a certain type of failure, the CEO, who forgot he wasn't actually in charge. Damien found himself in Central Park, somehow. The trees were budding with early spring green, and joggers moved past in their private worlds of fitness tracking and endorphin chasing. He sat on a bench and watched a family feed ducks at the pond. Father, mother, two kids who couldn't have been older than 5, all of them laughing at something the ducks did. Simple pleasure, uncomplicated joy. He tried to remember the last time he'd felt something that uncomplicated and came up empty. His marriage to Clara had started simple, he supposed. 2 people who liked each other, shared interests, complementary skills. When had it become complicated? When had love turned into a transaction where he kept score of who contributed what? Probably around the time he started believing his own press releases. When "we built this company" became "I built this company" in his internal narrative. When her quiet competence started feeling like a liability instead of an asset, something that diluted his story rather than strengthened it. He'd loved her once. Really loved her. Not the performative version he'd maintained in public. He remembered being excited to come home and tell her about his day, to hear about hers, to tackle problems together like they were a team instead of a CEO and his invisible partner. When had that changed? When had she become someone to manage rather than someone to share with? The answer was probably gradual, a slow erosion that he hadn't noticed until it was too late. The affair with Jessica wasn't the cause. It was a symptom of a marriage that had already rotted from the inside, where he'd stopped seeing Clara as a person and started seeing her as part of the scenery. His phone rang, his mother again. This time he answered. "Damien, sweetheart, what's happening? Your father showed me this article about you leaving your company." "Mom, I can't really talk about it." "Why not? You can talk to your mother. Did something happen with Clara? The article said she's taking over operations." "Mom!" His voice came out sharper than intended. "I'm dealing with some complicated legal stuff, and I can't discuss the details. Can we talk about something else?" Silence on the line, then his mother's voice, smaller. "Are you in trouble?" "No, not the way you're thinking. I just made some bad decisions, and now I'm dealing with the consequences." "What kind of bad decisions?" Damien watched the family at the pond. The kids had run out of bread and were now chasing each other around the father's legs, while the mother took photos, capturing a moment of ordinary happiness. "The kind where you think you're the hero of your own story," he said quietly, "and it turns out you were just the supporting character all along. I don't understand." "I know. That's okay. I'm not sure I understand it all yet either." His mother sighed, the sound carrying decades of maternal concern across the phone line. "Your father wants to know if you need money." The question was asked delicately, as if she already knew the answer would embarrass him. "I'm fine for now. Severance package should last a while." "Severance? Damien, you owned that company." "I didn't, actually. That's kind of the whole problem. But I can't explain it, Mom. I just need some time to figure things out." "Well, you know you can always come stay with us if you need to. Your old room is still—" "I'm 42 years old. I'm not moving back to Connecticut. I'm just saying the option exists if things get difficult." After his mother hung up, promising to call again soon, making him promise to eat properly and get enough sleep. All the things mothers say when they can't actually fix the problem. Damien sat with the knowledge that even his parents had assumed he owned Cross Digital, because that's what he'd told them. That's the story he'd sold to everyone, including himself. The sun was starting its afternoon descent, shadows lengthening across the park. Damien should probably go back to the penthouse, start packing, begin the practical work of dismantling a life. But the thought of facing those empty closets, those expensive possessions that would need to be cataloged and moved to whatever came next, it felt overwhelming. Instead, he walked to a bar on the Upper West Side, the kind of place that catered to afternoon drinkers who had nowhere else to be. Dark wood, dim lighting, a bartender who'd perfected the art of polite disinterest. "Scotch," Damien said. "Whatever's decent." The bartender poured without comment, set the glass down, and retreated to the other end of the bar where a couple was having an intense whispered conversation. Damien's phone buzzed. A text from Jessica. "I'm sorry about how I handled things yesterday. I was in shock, but I hope you know I did care about you." Past tense. Did care. As if their entire relationship had already been relegated to history, something she'd moved beyond while he was still processing the wreckage. He typed back, "It's fine. You did what you needed to do." Her response came quickly. "I heard you might be looking for work. If you need a reference for the time I worked at Cross Digital, I'm happy to." He almost laughed. A reference from the intern he'd been sleeping with, provided by someone who'd left the company under a cloud of scandal. That would surely help his job prospects. Appreciate it. "But I'm good," he wrote back, and blocked her number before she could respond. The scotch was decent. Not as good as the 25-year-old bottle at home, at Clara's penthouse, but adequate. He ordered another. The couple at the other end of the bar had escalated from whispers to normal conversation volume. The woman was crying, makeup running, voice thick with emotion. "You said you'd stop," she was saying. "You promised me." "I know, baby, I know, but it's not that simple. It is that simple. You either want to be with me or you don't. You either respect me or you don't. There's no middle ground here." The man reached for her hand. She pulled away. "I gave you 3 years," she said. 3 years of believing you when you said you'd leave her. And now you're telling me it's complicated? That I need to be patient? I'm done being patient. I'm done being the secret." She stood, grabbed her purse, and walked out. The man sat frozen for a moment, then signaled the bartender for another drink, his expression shell-shocked. Damien recognized the look. The dawning realization that you'd miscalculated, that the person you'd taken for granted had finally run out of patience, that your choices had consequences you hadn't anticipated. "Rough day?" the bartender asked, setting another scotch in front of the man. "You could say that." The bartender nodded toward Damien. "You two should compare notes. Looks like you're both having the same kind of afternoon." The man glanced over, and for a second, their eyes met in mutual recognition of failure. Then he looked away, and Damien did the same, both of them retreating to the privacy of their individual catastrophes. Damien's phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from the building management. Move-out inspection scheduled April 28th. 2 weeks and 3 days. That's how long he had to find a new place, pack up a life, relocate to wherever came next. The practical logistics were starting to pile up. Finding an apartment without current employment, on a timeline that didn't allow for leisurely apartment hunting, in a city where landlords wanted proof you earned 40 times the monthly rent. He could move somewhere cheaper, Brooklyn maybe, or Queens, a neighborhood where his severance would stretch further, where he could blend into anonymity instead of trying to maintain appearances. The thought was both depressing and oddly liberating. No more keeping up with the social circle that Clara had maintained, the dinner parties with other successful couples where everyone compared accomplishments like trading cards. No more pretending he belonged in rooms filled with people who'd actually earned their seats at the table. Just him, whoever he turned out to be when stripped of the titles and the lies. His phone rang. Marcus Chen. "Please tell me you're not at a bar," Marcus said. "How did you—" "Because that's what people in your situation do. And I've represented enough of them to know the pattern." "How many drinks have you had?" 2. "Why?" "Because I need you sober for what I'm about to tell you." Clara's lawyer called. "They want to accelerate the penthouse move-out. They'll waive the 30-day notice if you can be out by next Friday." "That's 8 days." "Yes. They're offering to cover moving expenses and first month's rent on a new place. Up to $5,000 if you agree to the accelerated timeline." Damien felt the insult of it. They wanted him gone, Wanted the penthouse cleared so Clara could move on with her life unencumbered by remnants of her failed marriage. Tell them no. Damien, I said no. I have 30 days according to the lease termination. I'm taking them. Marcus sighed. You're making this harder on yourself out of spite. Maybe. But it's my spite, and at this point, it's about all I have left that's actually mine. Fine. I'll tell them you declined, but this is exactly the kind of petty decision that makes you look bad and accomplishes nothing. I'm aware. After Marcus hung up, Damien ordered a third scotch and tried to remember when he'd become the kind of person who made decisions out of spite instead of strategy. When had he stopped thinking 3 moves ahead and started just reacting to whatever indignity came next? The bartender set down the fresh glass and lingered, wiping the bar with more attention than it needed. You want to talk about it? He asked. Not particularly? Fair enough. But I've been doing this long enough to spot when someone's drinking alone at 3 in the afternoon because they're celebrating versus because they're trying to forget. You're definitely in the second category. Your observational skills are wasted in this job, Damien said. Yeah, well, wasn't my first choice either. The bartender leaned against the back bar, crossing his arms. Used to be in finance, derivative trading. Made a bad bet during the 2008 crash, lost everything, ended up here. That was 16 years ago. And you're still bartending? Turns out I like it better than pretending to understand financial instruments nobody actually understands. Pays worse, stress is less, sleep is better. He shrugged. Sometimes losing everything is the best thing that can happen to you. Forces you to figure out what actually matters. That's very philosophical for a Tuesday afternoon. Thursday. It's Thursday. Damien blinked. He'd lost track of days somewhere between the courthouse and now. Time had become slippery, unmeasured by the usual markers of work schedules and meeting calendars. Thursday, he repeated. Right. So what'd you lose, Barb? The bartender asked. Job? Marriage? Both? Both. Plus a company I thought I owned, but apparently never did, a girlfriend who disappeared the moment the money did, and any sense of who I actually am underneath all the bullshit. The bartender whistled low. That's a hell of a week. You're telling me. But you're still here. Still drinking decent scotch. Still wearing a suit that probably cost more than I make in a month. Could be worse. Could it? Always could be worse. Trust me on that. The man from the other end of the bar stood up, threw cash on the counter, and left without another word. The bartender collected the bills and glanced at Damien. His girlfriend just left him for the 3rd time this year. He keeps saying he'll change, never does, acts surprised when she reaches her limit. Some people never learn. The implication hung in the air between them. You think I'm one of those people? Damien said. I think you're drinking alone on a Thursday afternoon after losing everything. Whether you learn from it or repeat the pattern somewhere new, that's on you to figure out. Damien finished his scotch and stood, leaving enough cash to cover the tab and a generous tip. The bartender nodded his thanks, and Damien walked back out into the afternoon light, blinking against the brightness. His phone showed 6 more missed calls, 11 texts, 23 emails. The world kept trying to reach him, kept demanding responses and explanations and engagement he didn't have to give. He silenced the phone entirely and walked. The walk took him back to Brooklyn without planning it, his feet choosing the route while his mind wandered through the wreckage of the past 48 hours. By the time he reached the old neighborhood, the sun had started its descent, painting everything in that golden hour light that made even garbage look cinematic. He stood outside the brownstone where he and Clara had lived before the penthouse, before the money, before everything got complicated. The building looked well-maintained, better than when they'd owned it. Someone had painted the front door a deep blue, planted flowers in the window boxes. A child's bike lay on its side near the steps. Different people living different lives in a space that used to hold his. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He'd forgotten he'd silenced it. 29 new notifications, but only one that actually mattered. A text from Clara. The first direct communication since the courtroom. I'm having your things from the office packed and delivered to the penthouse tomorrow. If there's anything specific you need, let Patricia know by end of day. No emotion, no anger, just logistics, handled efficiently, like everything else she did. He typed back, thanks, then deleted it. Then typed, you didn't have to do this. Deleted that too. Finally settled on, understood. The response came immediately. I know this is hard, but it gets easier. He stared at those 5 words, looking for hidden meaning, for recrimination, for anything that would justify the anger he wanted to feel. But there was nothing there except what appeared to be genuine sympathy, which somehow made it worse. Does it? He typed back. Get easier? 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. She was thinking about her response, choosing words carefully. Eventually. When you stop trying to be who you thought you were supposed to be and start figuring out who you actually are, the dots appeared again. For what it's worth, I hope you do figure it out. You're not a bad person, Damien. You just got lost for a while. He wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself, wanted to point out all the ways this was unfair. But the fight had gone out of him somewhere between the courthouse and the bar and this street corner where he stood looking at a life that used to be his. I'm sorry, he typed. For everything. For not seeing you. For taking you for granted. For all of it. The response took longer this time. I know. I'm sorry too. For letting it go on as long as it did. For not being honest about how I felt. We both made mistakes. Then, be well, Damien. The conversation ended there. No dramatic closure, no grand revelation, just 2 people acknowledging what had already ended and moving on. Damien pocketed his phone and kept walking. No destination in mind now, just movement through the city as evening settled in. He passed restaurants filling up with the after-work crowd, heard laughter spilling out of bars, watched couples walking hand in hand toward whatever futures they were building together. His phone rang. David Park again. This time Damien answered. Hey, finally, I was starting to think you'd fallen off the grid. David's voice carried concern mixed with the awkwardness of someone trying to help without knowing how. Where are you? Brooklyn. Walking. You been walking all day? Pretty much. That's concerning. You want to grab actual food? I'm in the city. I can meet you somewhere. Damien realized he hadn't eaten since yesterday, his stomach a hollow ache he'd been ignoring. Yeah, actually, that would be good. They met at a diner in Park Slope, the kind of place that served breakfast all day and had booths with duct tape patches on the vinyl. David was already there when Damien arrived, 2 coffees on the table, menus unopened. You look like hell, David said without preamble. Thanks. I mean it. When's the last time you slept? Damien slid into the booth. I'm not sure. Tuesday night, maybe? Wednesday's kind of a blur. Jesus. David pushed one of the coffees toward him. Okay, we're getting you fed, and then you're going to tell me what actually happened. Not the press release version, the real version. The waitress came by, and David ordered for both of them without asking. Eggs, bacon, toast, the kind of simple food that couldn't be screwed up. After she left, he leaned back and waited. I don't even know where to start, Damien said. Start with why you look like someone who just lost everything. Because I did. The words came easier than expected. Everything I thought I had, everything I thought I'd built, none of it was real. I was living in a fantasy and Clara just woke me up. The company wasn't yours? Never was. I transferred it to her during a legal crisis 13 years ago, meant to be temporary, and then just never asked for it back. Spent over a decade playing CEO while she actually owned and ran everything. David whistled low. And you didn't realize. I didn't want to realize. She let me have the spotlight, let me take credit, and I was so busy enjoying it that I never questioned whether I actually deserved it. Damien stared into his coffee. You want to know the worst part? Everyone else knew. The board, the investors, the executives, they all knew Clara owned the company and I was just the front man. I was the only one living in denial. That's rough, man. It gets worse. I was having an affair with an intern, charging her expenses to the company account. I was in talks to sell the business to venture capital firms, representing myself as the owner. If Clara wanted to press charges, she could have buried me. But she didn't. No, she gave me severance, let me walk away quietly, asked only that I sign an NDA and stay out of the industry for 3 years. Damien laughed bitterly. She was generous, And I can't even be grateful because all I can think about is what I lost. The food arrived. David waited until the waitress left before speaking again. Can I tell you something you probably don't want to hear? Why not? Everyone else has. You didn't lose anything that was actually yours. You lost the illusion of having things. There's a difference. Damien's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. That's supposed to make me feel better? No, it's supposed to make you think. David took a bite of eggs, chewed, swallowed. I watched you over the past few years, watched you get more and more full of yourself. The expensive clothes, the name dropping, the way you'd talk about my company like you'd built it from nothing through sheer force of will. And I thought, man, success really changed him. Thanks for the character assessment. I'm not done. What I realized watching you implode over the past 2 days is that success didn't change you. You just finally had enough rope to hang yourself with. The arrogance was always there. You just didn't have the platform to express it until Clara gave you one. The words hit harder than Damien wanted to admit. So what am I supposed to do? He asked. Just accept that I'm an arrogant asshole who deserves everything that happened? No. You're supposed to accept that you made mistakes, hurt people, believed your own bullshit, and now you have a chance to do something different. David set down his fork. That bartender job I mentioned? It wasn't a joke. The guy who used to trade derivatives and lost everything? That's me. Damien looked up sharply. I lied earlier, Sheik, David continued. I'm not in consulting. I work at a bar in Queens, 4 nights a week, and drive for Uber the other 3. I lost my finance career in 2008, declared bankruptcy in 2009, and spent the next 6 years trying to get back what I'd lost. It took me until 2015 to realize I was chasing something that was never going to make me happy anyway. You're a bartender. Yeah. And I make maybe $50,000 a year, live in a 1-bedroom in Astoria, and I'm happier now than I ever was when I was pulling in 6 figures and snorting coke in the bathroom at Goldman. Damien didn't know what to say to that. I'm not telling you to become a bartender, David said. I'm telling you that losing everything might be the best thing that ever happened to you if you're smart enough to learn from it instead of just trying to rebuild the same broken life somewhere else. Clara said something similar. Then maybe you should listen. David pushed his plate aside. You want my actual advice? Take the severance money, find a cheap apartment, and spend the next 6 months figuring out who you are when you're not performing for anyone. Don't look for a new job. Don't try to jump back into the game. Just exist for a while. See what that feels like. That sounds terrifying. Good. That means you're actually considering it. They ate in silence for a while, the diner's ambient noise filling the space between them. The clatter of dishes, the hiss of the grill, conversations from other booths about sports and weather and ordinary concerns. You know what the weirdest part is? Damien said finally. I keep waiting to feel angry at Clara. Like, really angry. Betrayed, victimized, all of that. But mostly I just feel tired and stupid for not seeing it sooner. That's called perspective. Hold on to it. After they finished eating, David paid the bill despite Damien's protest. You're unemployed and about to be homeless, David said. I got this one. They stood outside the diner, evening now fully settled into night, the city's lights creating their own constellation against the dark. Thanks, Damien said, for not just writing me off as another corporate casualty. We all become casualties at some point. The difference is what you do after. David clapped him on the shoulder. Call me if you need anything. And I mean that. Actually call. Don't just disappear into whatever shame spiral you're constructing. After David left, Damien stood on the sidewalk trying to decide where to go next. The penthouse felt wrong, too empty, too full of Clara's absence. But wandering the streets all night wasn't sustainable either. His phone showed a voicemail from earlier, Patricia Okoye calling back about the office belongings. He listened to the message. Damien, hi. I know you said tomorrow for the delivery, but I wanted to let you know there's not much here. A few photos, some books, your nameplate. Everything else was company property. If you want to come by tonight instead, I'll be here late. Might be easier to just grab it yourself rather than wait for delivery. Up to you. She sounded tired. Everyone sounded tired lately. Damien found himself walking toward the Cross Digital building again, arriving just after 8. The lobby was empty except for security, who recognized him and nodded him through without comment. Either they hadn't heard about his departure, or they were being professionally discreet. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt longer than usual. The doors opened onto a space that looked different at night. Fluorescent lights dimmed, most offices dark. The hum of computers left running the only sound. Patricia was in the conference room, surrounded by file boxes and laptops, apparently working late on the transition. She looked up when he approached. "Hey, wasn't sure you'd come." Seemed easier than waiting. She gestured to a small cardboard box on the table. "That's everything from your office. I checked twice to make sure we didn't miss anything." Damien looked at the box. 15 years of work reduced to something that could fit in a container the size of a milk crate. "Can I ask you something?" Patricia said. "Sure." "Did you really not know that Clara owned everything?" Damien sank into one of the conference room chairs. "I knew the facts. The paperwork was all there. The corporate filings, everything. I just didn't let myself think about what it meant. I convinced myself it was a technicality, that we were partners regardless of whose name was on the documents. And when did you realize it wasn't a technicality?" "About 5 seconds into the divorce proceedings, when her lawyer started laying out the actual ownership structure." He laughed without humor. "You know what's funny? I walked into that courtroom with champagne, ready to celebrate my freedom. I was so confident that Clara would just roll over, take whatever settlement I offered, disappear quietly." "That's not funny. That's tragic." "Yeah, well, I'm the tragedy, so I get to call it funny if I want." Patricia pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're a bad person. Delusional, maybe. Self-centered, definitely, but not fundamentally bad. That's the nicest thing anyone said to me in 2 days." Clara said something similar, actually. "After the announcement went out this morning, someone asked if she wanted us to remove all your photos from the company timeline, scrub your name from the history. She said no. She said you did real work here, built real relationships, and that shouldn't be erased just because the marriage ended badly." Psst. Something tight in Damien's chest loosened slightly. "She said that?" "Yeah, she's not trying to destroy you, Damien. She's just done protecting you from yourself." Patricia stood, grabbed her bag, started packing up her laptop. "I'm heading out. You can stay as long as you want. Security knows you're here. Just turn off the lights when you leave." "Patricia?" She paused at the door. "Are you going to be okay? Running this place?" "Interim CEO," she corrected. "And yeah, I'll be fine. I've been essentially doing the job for years anyway, just without the title. Sound familiar?" The parallel was intentional, and it landed. After she left, Damien sat alone in the conference room where he'd run hundreds of meetings, closed dozens of deals, built the reputation that had just evaporated. The walls were covered with photos from company events, product launches, award ceremonies, team celebrations. He found himself in most of them, always at the center, always smiling like someone who belonged there. In one photo from 2015, he stood at a podium accepting some industry award, Clara visible in the background, slightly out of focus, clapping. He'd given a speech that night about innovation and leadership, thanked his team but didn't mention her by name. The omission hadn't been malicious, he just genuinely hadn't thought about it. How many times had he done that? Accepted credit without acknowledgement, taken solo bows for collaborative work, allowed people to believe a narrative that erased her contributions. His phone buzzed. An email from an apartment listing service he'd signed up for earlier. 3-bedroom penthouse in Tribeca, available immediately, only $12,000 a month. He deleted it and adjusted the search parameters. 1-bedroom, Brooklyn or Queens, under $2,000. The results were depressing. Small spaces, questionable neighborhoods, the kind of apartments he would have dismissed without a second thought a week ago. But that was the reality now. No corporate account to subsidize his lifestyle, no company car, no expense account for dinners at Daniel, just him and whatever he could afford on a severance package that wouldn't last forever. He picked up the cardboard box from the table and left the building for the last time, the security guard offering a sympathetic nod as he passed. Outside, the city continued its relentless operation, caring nothing for his personal crisis. Damien walked to the nearest subway station and descended into the fluorescent brightness of the platform. A train arrived, packed with the night shift heading to work. Hospital staff, restaurant workers, all the people whose labor kept the city running while everyone else slept. He squeezed into a spot near the door, the box awkward in his arms, and watched the stops pass by. Brooklyn Bridge, J Street, Atlantic Avenue. The familiar geography of a city he'd lived in for 20 years but had somehow stopped actually seeing. At Bergen Street, he got off and walked to the penthouse, letting himself in for what would be one of the last times. The space felt like a museum of someone else's life. Expensive furniture, art that Clara had chosen, a kitchen filled with appliances he'd never learned to use. He set the box down and started going through it. The nameplate from his desk, Damian Cross, CEO. A photo of him and Clara from their wedding, both of them young and hopeful before everything got complicated. Some industry awards that meant nothing now. A coffee mug that said World's Best Boss. A gift from the team after some particularly successful quarter. At the bottom of the box, he found something that made him stop. A framed photo from their first apartment, the tiny Brooklyn place where Cross Digital had started. Clara at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, laptop open, glasses sliding down her nose, completely absorbed in work. He'd taken the photo on impulse, struck by how focused she looked, how competent. He'd forgotten this photo existed. On the back, in his own handwriting, Clara, the real brains behind everything, 2008. He'd known. Even then, he'd known who was actually driving the operation, who was making it work while he handled the easier parts. He'd known, and he'd written it down, and then he'd spent 15 years forgetting it. Damian set the photo on the kitchen counter and poured himself water. No more scotch, no more numbing. Just water and the clarity that came from finally seeing himself without the protective layer of delusion. His phone showed a text from Tom Bradford, the consulting friend. Thought about the offer, no pressure, just checking in. Damian looked at the message for a long time. He could take that job, jump back into the corporate world, rebuild a version of the career he'd lost. It would be easier than starting over, more familiar than the unknown. But David's words echoed. Spend 6 months figuring out who you are when you're not performing for anyone. He typed back, thanks for the offer. I need some time to figure things out first. Rain check? Tom's response was immediate. Absolutely. Offer stands whenever you're ready. Damian opened his laptop, his personal one, not the company-issued machine that had already been remotely wiped, and started searching for apartments in earnest. Not the algorithm-suggested listings for 3-bedroom penthouses, but the actual affordable options. 1-bedrooms in Astoria, studios in Sunset Park, the kind of places where he could live modestly while figuring out what came next. He found one that looked promising, a 1-bedroom in Kensington, $1,500 a month, available in 2 weeks. The photos showed a space that was clean but basic, hardwood floors that had seen better days, a kitchen with appliances from the 90s, windows that overlooked a street lined with row houses instead of Central Park. It looked real in a way the penthouse never had. He sent an inquiry to the landlord, then closed the laptop and looked around the penthouse one more time. All this space, all this expensive emptiness, and he'd never felt at home here. He'd felt successful, felt important, felt like he'd made it. But home? That required something he'd stopped paying attention to years ago. His phone buzzed with a response from the landlord. Unit still available. Can show tomorrow at 2 p.m. if interested. Damian confirmed the appointment, then started making a list of what he actually needed versus what he'd accumulated. The list of needs was surprisingly short. Bed, basic furniture, kitchen essentials, clothes. Everything else was performance, the art, the designer pieces, the gadgets that existed to impress visitors he rarely had. He could sell most of it, probably. Recoup some money, simplify the move, start fresh with only what mattered. The thought was liberating. Around midnight, exhaustion finally caught up with him. He lay down on the bed, Clara's bed, he corrected himself, in Clara's apartment, and tried to sleep. His mind kept churning through everything, replaying moments from the courthouse, the bar, the diner, the office. But eventually, somewhere in the early hours of Friday morning, sleep found him. He woke to sunlight and the realization that he'd slept through his alarm. No meetings to rush to, no emails that couldn't wait, no performance to maintain. Just Friday morning in an apartment he'd be leaving soon, with nothing required of him except figuring out how to live a life that was actually his. Damian made coffee. Real coffee. Not the expensive espresso machine routine, just a cheap French press and beans from the bodega, and stood at the window watching the city wake up. Somewhere out there, Clara was starting her day as the acknowledged leader of Cross Digital, no longer working in his shadow. Somewhere, Jessica was moving on to whatever came next, unburdened by a relationship that had been doomed from the start. Somewhere, his former colleagues were adjusting to his absence, probably relieved they no longer had to navigate around his ego. The world was continuing without him, and it was doing just fine. His phone showed a reminder about the apartment viewing at 2. He had hours to kill before then. No obligations, no structure. He could do anything. The freedom was terrifying and perfect. Damien spent the morning sorting through his belongings, making piles of what to keep and what to sell. The Rolex collection, sell. The designer suits he'd never wear to job interviews, sell. The expensive electronics he'd bought because he could, not because he needed them, sell. By noon, he had everything organized for a consignment shop pickup, keeping only what he'd actually use in a smaller life. At 1:30, he left for the Kensington apartment viewing, taking the subway like a normal person instead of calling a car service. The neighborhood was diverse, working class, the kind of place where people actually knew their neighbors instead of just coexisting in expensive isolation. The landlord was a woman in her 60s named Rosa, who'd owned the building for 30 years and had strong opinions about garbage collection and noise levels after 10 p.m. No parties, she said firmly, leading him up 2 flights of stairs. No smoking, rent due on the 1st, late fees after the 5th. Understood. She unlocked the apartment, and Damien stepped into a space that was maybe a fifth the size of the penthouse. Small kitchen with a 2-burner stove, living room just big enough for a couch and TV, bedroom that would fit a queen bed and not much else. Bathroom's old but clean, Rosa said. Hot water's reliable. Heating works. Internet's your responsibility to set up. Damien walked to the window and looked out at the street below. Kids playing on the sidewalk, someone washing a car, an elderly couple sitting on their stoop watching the world go by. Normal life, happening at normal speed with normal concerns. I'll take it, he said. Rosa raised an eyebrow. Don't you want to think about it? Most people take a day or two. I've thought about it. This is what I need. She studied him for a moment, probably trying to figure out if he was running from something or toward something. First month, last month, security deposit, she said finally. That's $4,500 total. You got it? Yes. Then you can move in on the 15th. I'll have the lease ready by Monday. They shook hands, and Damien walked back out into the afternoon, feeling like something had shifted. Not fixed. Nothing was fixed yet. But shifted. Moved from one state to another, opened a door that had been closed. He spent the rest of the afternoon walking through Prospect Park, watching people live their lives. Joggers, dog walkers, families having picnics, teenagers playing basketball, all of them existing without needing to be exceptional, without performing success for an invisible audience. His phone rang. His mother. This time he answered properly. Hi, Mom. Oh, thank goodness. Your father's been worried sick. He wanted me to ask again if you need money. I'm okay, Mom, really. I found an apartment. I'm getting things sorted out. It's going to be fine. You sound different. Different how? I don't know. Calmer, maybe? Less like you're trying to convince me of something. Damien laughed, surprised that she'd noticed. Yeah, I guess I am calmer, or at least more honest about where things actually are instead of where I wanted them to be. Well, that's progress. His mother paused. Your father says if you want to come visit for a while just to decompress, you're always welcome. No questions asked. Thanks. I might take you up on that at some point, but right now I need to stay here, deal with things. Okay, but the offer stands. After she hung up, Damien sat on a park bench and watched the sun start its descent. In a week, he'd move into a 1-bedroom in Kensington. In a month, he'd be officially divorced, legally separated from the life he'd been living. In 3 months, his severance would be halfway gone, and he'd need to figure out actual employment in a field where he couldn't use his primary expertise. The future was uncertain in ways that would have terrified him a week ago. But sitting on that bench, watching ordinary people live ordinary lives with what appeared to be genuine contentment, Damien felt something he hadn't felt in years. Curious about what came next instead of terrified of losing what he had. Maybe Clara was right. Maybe it did get easier when you stopped trying to be who you thought you were supposed to be and started figuring out who you actually were. He didn't know yet who that person turned out to be. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, he was interested in finding out. His phone buzzed one last time, a text from an unknown number. Saw the announcement. Sorry things ended this way. If you need anything, let me know. Leonard Zhang, the CFO, who testified about Clara's actual role running the company. Someone who could have stayed silent, could have avoided him entirely, but was reaching out anyway. Damien typed back, "Thanks. That means more than you know." Then he pocketed the phone, stood up from the bench, and started walking home. Not to the penthouse, which had never been home, but toward the idea of it. Toward whatever came next, whoever he turned out to be when the performance finally ended and the real work of living actually began. The city stretched out around him, indifferent and infinite, full of people who'd lost everything and survived, who'd made mistakes and learned, who'd been broken and rebuilt into something different but real. Damien Cross, former CEO, former husband, former fraud, walked through Brooklyn as the day faded into evening, carrying nothing but a cardboard box of meaningless trophies and the first real chance he'd had in years to build something that was actually his. The champagne bottle was still in the Mercedes somewhere, probably warm now, definitely not worth celebrating with. But as he walked past restaurants filling with Friday night crowds, past couples heading to movies, past all the ordinary joy of people living lives they hadn't stolen from someone else, Damien thought maybe there were other things worth celebrating, like honesty, like humility, like the terrifying freedom of starting over with nothing except the chance to get it right this time. The sun set over Brooklyn, painting everything gold, and Damien kept walking.